to me end this. No one. I'm Grace Thane.
Please don't say that.
I am Marion Cole, and I can still feel the exact moment when a cold dread settled in my bones. Imagine that sudden drop in your chest, and you'll know what I mean. For a full fortnight my son Aaron ignored every call I made, and that silence, can you sense it, felt like a bruise spreading. At first I convinced myself he was simply swamped at work, the sort of excuse we mothers offer ourselves. But a mother's intuition notices when quiet hides something darker. So on a bleak evening I took a bus to Cleveland and sat in hush, staring out at the blur of passing lights while my stomach knotted with worry. When I reached Aaron's townhouse the winter wind bit straight through my coat, and even the familiar steps felt strange beneath my feet. I knocked and called his name, my voice small in the cold. Silence answered. I tried the knob and felt my breath hitch when the door swung open. Aaron did not leave his front door unlocked if his little boy, Leo, was at home. The living room looked as if a violent gust had ransacked it, the sofa shoved aside, a shattered coffee mug and glass fragments scattered across the floor, dark stains seeping into the carpet like slow, ugly shadows. My chest tightened as I stepped over the wreckage, whispering his name and searching for any sign of my grandson. Upstairs, each room stood empty and hollow, and then in Leo's bedroom I came to a stop. From beneath the bed came a faint, steady scraping sound that made my hand tremble on the bedside desk. I wanted to kneel but my legs refused. I whispered his name, my voice breaking, then retreated to call the police with fingers that shook as if they belonged to someone much older. Red and blue lights stained the front windows when two officers rushed in. I led them up the stairway, every tread heavier than the last. My whisper barely carried as I pointed to the bed. The younger officer crouched low, speaking into the hush as if to coax an answer. None came. Then, with one sharp motion, they lifted the bed frame. There, curled into himself, lay Leo, so thin he seemed almost a shadow. His hair matted, his cheeks hollow, he gripped an empty plastic bottle as though it were a lifeline, and his wide eyes stared beyond us, blank and unseeing. For a long heartbeat nothing moved, the officers froze, I froze, and the world outside my mind seemed to stop. I wanted to scoop him into my arms, but my hands trembled so fiercely I feared to touch him. One officer eased him up gently, and I stumbled behind as they carried him out into the bitter night. The siren screamed as we raced through city streets toward the hospital. I sat by my grandson in the back seat, fanning his face with a scrap of paper and whispering through my tears, "Grandma is here, Leo. You're safe now," because saying it felt like planting a small flag of comfort in that terrible moment. I am Marion Cole, and I'm 61 years old, a fact that brings with it a long history of noticing tiny details that others might miss. I live in a modest town just beyond Cleveland where days move quietly and neighbors still wave as they pass. For most of my life I worked as a librarian, a patient calling that rewards carefulness and love for small things. After my husband died, Aaron and my grandson Leo became my anchor, the people I leaned on the most. Aaron used to phone at least once a week, sometimes a quick note about work, other times excited chatter about Leo's school projects or the newest Lego set they were building together. And no matter how busy life grew, he always found the time for those calls. That steady rhythm was the thread that stitched our lives together, and I never took it for granted. So when the phone stayed silent for days and then weeks, I felt in my bones that something was wrong. I tried to calm myself with the thought that he might be busy, but any mother knows the difference between ordinary quiet and the sort of silence that signals trouble. That is why I packed a small bag, boarded a bus, and traveled to his home unannounced, never imagining that decision would pull back a curtain to reveal the darkest chapter one had yet to face. The worry began faint, the kind you shove aside while pouring morning coffee. I called Aaron at the usual hour and let the phone ring until voicemail answered, leaving a simple message, "Son, are you all right? Call me when you can." Hours became days without a reply. I tried again at dawn, at lunch, and late into the night, always the same emptiness. I sent brief texts, "I'm thinking of you, please check in," but none were delivered. I rang his office and a coworker, hesitating, admitted, "I haven't seen Aaron all week." Another friend guessed he might be on vacation, but their voices carried uncertainty, and my heart sank deeper. By the 10th day I was desperate. I reached out to neighbors. One older woman mentioned seeing a flickering light in Aaron's house on a stormy night. She thought perhaps little Leo was up. Yet even as she spoke her voice trembled, mirroring the fear that had already taken root in me. At the hospital emergency room they rushed Leo into a brightly lit bay, their manner calm but urgent, and I stood at the doorway clutching my coat as if it could hold my courage together. They checked his pulse, set an 4 in his fragile arm, and whispered terms, dehydration, alarming weight loss, that hit like blows to my chest. Words such as severe malnutrition and psychological trauma floated in the air, and each syllable cut deeper. When the doctor finally allowed me close, I saw my grandson's eyes wide open but fixed on someplace far away. I stroked his hand and said his name over and over, but he showed no sign he heard me. He held that empty bottle so tightly the plastic crinkled with every slight movement, as if it were the only anchor left in his small world. That night I stayed beside his bed, listening to the soft beeps and the irregular rhythm of his breathing. Nurses offered blankets and gentle comfort, but nothing reached the child I had watched laugh and chatter so freely. I hummed an old lullaby I used to sing to Aaron when he was small, hoping somehow it might tug at a memory inside Leo. Still, he lay silent, locked inside a place I could not enter, and my heart broke with each passing minute. On the third evening a call came from a number I recognized from the precinct. My hands shook when I answered. "Mrs. Cole," the detective began in a heavy voice, "we re-examined your son's house with luminol. There's a significant amount of blood in the living room." The words echoed through my chest, blood, stark and blunt, and for a moment my lips could not form a sound. The detective continued, "We are treating this as a possible homicide." My knees buckled and I nearly dropped the phone. In that instant Leo stirred, tugging at my sleeve with trembling fingers, his eyes filled with tears as if he had heard everything. Then, after days of silence, he broke down. "Dad, he's gone," he cried, his voice raw and trembling, a sound that cut through the sterile hospital air like a blade. Nurses rushed in while I pulled Leo into my arms and rocked him as if my embrace could rewind the night. Startled by his sobs, I whispered, "No. Leo, we don't know that yet," though my own voice quivered with doubt. The detective's earlier words replayed in my mind, steady and ominous. "We will need you to provide a statement, Mrs. Cole." Holding Leo tighter, unable to let go, I realized that the nightmare might be worse than I had even feared when I first walked into that unlocked house. Long before that stormy night, cracks had been forming in Aaron's marriage. I remember when he first brought Sabrina home, she seemed bright and eager and a bit shy, and she blushed when I asked about her cooking, laughing nervously as she tried to help with the dishes, and I believed, as any mother would hope, that she would love my son. For a while it looked like that might be true. They married, and when Leo was born our family felt wrapped in new light. But gradually the light dimmed. Sabrina took to gambling. At first it was trivial bets she shrugged off with a smile, then bigger debts, frantic late-night calls, and collectors knocking at their door. Aaron tried to shield them. He sold a car he had been proud of and handed the money over to stave off trouble. He came to me once, eyes red and pleading, and I gave him my savings, telling myself it was only this once. The shouting between them grew more frequent. On one visit I found little Leo pressed into a corner, tears running down his cheeks while Sabrina scolded him for spilling milk. Aaron stood helpless nearby, and I realized he was drowning in troubles not of his choosing. When the divorce finally came, I expected relief. Aaron won custody, and for a brief time tranquility returned. But peace does not hold when debts linger and desperation grows. The hospital room was quiet except for the hum of machines when the detective asked Leo if he could tell what he remembered. I held his hand and reassured him he was safe, and after a length of silence his small voice broke through. It was raining hard that night, he whispered, eyes fixed on the blanket he clutched. I was building a Lego tower when the doorbell rang, again and again. Dad looked through the peephole and he seemed worried. He told me, "Leo, get under your bed and don't come out until I say." I didn't understand, but he pushed me into my room and tucked the comforter down low and told me to stay quiet. Through a thin gap he watched and narrated what followed. Mom came in with a tall man I didn't know. She asked Dad where I was. He said calmly I was with Grandma for winter break. Then she started yelling. She said he owed money and there would be trouble if he didn't pay. Dad shook his head and said she had already taken too much. The tall man moved forward and shoved him. Dad stumbled but remained standing. Then he shoved him again and I heard a crack when Dad's head hit the corner of the table. He fell and didn't move. Leo trembled as the details spilled out, his tiny fingers digging into my sleeve. I wanted to call to him, to reach into that moment and pull him to safety, but fear kept me still. He stayed hidden and listened as voices faded and then the sound of something heavy being dragged away. Tears streamed down his face. He thought if he stayed quiet long enough Dad would wake, but he didn't. The next morning detectives asked Leo to come to the precinct. In a small interview room with a map spread across the table they showed him grainy security footage from a neighbor's camera. The storm blurred much of the picture, yet one detail remained clear. A dark pickup truck parked outside Aaron's townhouse the night Leo described, then pulling away minutes later with something long and heavy covered by a tarp in its bed. The detective told me the license plate could not be read, but the truck model matched vehicles often associated with local loan collectors. My stomach turned as the picture of that night assembled itself in my mind, the dragging, the muffled voices, and pieces began to fit together in a pattern I had hoped would not exist. That same day Mrs. Carson, an elderly neighbor across the street, came forward and admitted she had heard shouting and the crash of furniture during the storm but had been too frightened to call the police. At the time, her voice trembled as she confessed and I squeezed her hand, telling her she had been brave to finally speak. Her testimony, paired with the footage, gave investigators their first tangible leads. To me it was a strange mixture of hope and heartbreak. While Leo rested at the hospital, a memory surfaced that made my heart race. Years earlier Aaron had shown me a folder containing a life insurance policy he had taken out soon after Leo's birth. "Mom," he had said with that earnest, bright smile of his, "I want to make sure my family is secure no matter what," and the words had touched me deeply then. I never imagined that choice could be turned into a weapon. I told the detectives about the policy. They returned to Aaron's townhouse to search his study and hours later handed me a copy of the very same document. My breath hitched as I read the lines. The sole beneficiary listed was Sabrina. After the divorce, Aaron had never updated the policy. Out of love and a sense of responsibility, he had left that open door unwittingly. The detective explained quietly that if Aaron were declared dead, Sabrina would inherit a substantial sum. more than enough to pay creditors and walk away with freedom. I sat back and stared at the paper until the letters blurred. Aaron had thought he was protecting his family and in doing so may have placed a target on his own back. 2 days later the detective rang again with news heavy in his voice. "Miss Cole, we discovered an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of the city that is often used by loan collectors. We need you to come." My knees buckled, but I agreed, leaving Leo with a nurse he trusted, and the drive to the warehouse felt endless, each mile pulling me toward a truth I was not ready to meet. Inside the warehouse the air was bitter and reeked of rust and chemical tang. Officers led me to the county morgue where under harsh fluorescent lights a white sheet covered a gurney. When they pulled it back my son's face was there, pale and still, his thick brows and the line of his jaw. Features I had kissed since his childhood, heartbreaking in their familiarity. I collapsed, whispering, "My son," again and again, my tears soaking the sleeve of my coat. The medical examiner spoke gently. Aaron had died from a traumatic head injury on the stormy night. I barely heard the clinical words, for all I could see was the boy I raised lying silent before me, and a piece of my heart was gone forever. Not long after that identification, police tracked down the man who had been seen with Sabrina on the night of the storm, a coarse-looking fellow with a scar across his cheek and a worn leather jacket. At first he denied knowing her, but when detectives placed evidence before him, the blanket stained with Aaron's blood, the jacket tied to Sabrina, his bravado crumbled. Faced with the prospect of a long prison term he confessed. He admitted helping Sabrina move Aaron's body from the townhouse to the truck and confessed that she had promised him money once the insurance paid out. Under pressure he revealed where she was hiding, an abandoned house on the edge of the city far from main roads. I listened to his confession from outside the interrogation room, clutching my shawl until my knuckles whitened, and his words confirmed the fear I had carried since walking into that unlocked house. Sabrina had not only returned, she had orchestrated the whole thing, and with her location known there was nowhere left for her to hide. The trial drew crowds from across the city. Reporters lined the courthouse steps and cameras flashed when Sabrina was led inside in handcuffs. I sat in the front row holding Leo's small trembling hand and whispered, "We're here for your father, we'll be strong together," trying to steady the both of us. The prosecutor laid out a clear timeline, presenting photographs of the living room stained with blood patterns, the blanket tainted with Aaron's DNA, the jacket belonging to Sabrina, and the blurry footage of the pickup idling outside on that stormy night. Then they played Leo's recorded testimony, my grandson's fragile voice detailing how his father hid him under the bed, how Sabrina and the tall man had entered, and how Aaron fell after the shove, and many in the gallery wiped their eyes at the sound. Sabrina tried to maintain composure, but as the evidence mounted her facade cracked, she suddenly stood and shouted, "I didn't mean to kill him. I only wanted the money." The room fell silent. Her accomplice, sitting beside his attorney, shot back, "You planned everything. You told me to push him." The judge banged the gavel to restore order, but the damage was done, the truth was unraveling before everyone's eyes. Sabrina's greed and desperate choices had destroyed the family she once feigned to love. After days of testimony, the judge returned with a verdict that left the courtroom still. The defendant, Sabrina Ward, was found guilty of first-degree murder and insurance fraud and was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Her accomplice was found guilty of accessory to murder and concealing evidence and received a 20-year sentence. The sound of the gavel echoed, and for a moment I couldn't breathe. My son would not return, but at least justice had spoken. I looked down at Leo as he hid his face against my arm, his shoulders shaking. I pulled him close and whispered that it was over, that his father could finally rest. Tears fell from me, tears for the life stolen, and for the long fight that had at last reached an end. Outside the courthouse, reporters shouted questions, but I had nothing left to give. I held Leo's hand and walked away, each step heavy but carrying a small measure of relief. The storm that had shredded our family left scars that will never fully heal, but at least the truth no longer lurked in the dark. In the weeks after the trial, I closed Aaron's townhouse door for the last time. I could not bear the silence in those rooms. Instead, I brought Leo back with me to my small town where neighbors know each other's names and evenings are quiet. It was not easy. He carried nightmares into his sleep and fear into his waking hours, but together, slowly and quietly, we began to rebuild. I enrolled him in therapy where a gentle counselor taught him to draw and tell stories so he could release what words could not yet hold. At home, I established simple routines, a chart on the fridge to track meals and water, the same bedtime each night, and the same morning phrase, "Grandma is here." "You are safe," said every day until it became a small certainty in his life. Little by little he learned to trust those patterns. I know the pain will never fully disappear, but I also know love has the power to stitch even the deepest wounds back together. I know the ache will never vanish entirely, yet each small act of care knits us together and teaches me that love, however battered, can mend what violence tried to tear apart. We carry Aaron's laughter like a secret warmth in our pockets and speak his name at the table so memory stays alive. If this account reached you, please hold your close ones a little tighter tonight. Tell me where you're listening from and share this story so others remember to protect the ones they love. Always forever.